Guys, it is finally time. I finally get to talk about the book I genuinely think is the best in this series. Not my favorite, but the one I do think is the best, or at least I did going into this reread. The question now is if I still think it holds the top spot, or did Goblet of Fire come for its crown? So let's find out. So from the jump, this might be the best opener of any book in the series. Like, I know I said that about Order of the Phoenix, but I didn't exactly remember the entirety of Half-Blood Prince and like how it started. And now I have to reconsider, because the conversation between the Muggle Minister and the now deposed Fudge was probably one of the more unique conversations we've got in the series, because for once, we as the readers are in the know, and it is the Muggle Minister that is in the dark. Like, we know why his assistant was acting strange. We know the source of the murders. We know why the two people were targeted. We know why the bridge magically collapsed. And because we know all of that, it really keys us into the fact that while the Muggle world is not the primary takeover target of Voldemort, the worlds are not as disconnected from each other as we might have first thought. They definitely both face the consequences of Voldemort's return. We then shift to Spinner's End, where we see Snape still lives in his old family home, and I don't know how much of a parallel this is to, like, Harry or how much it was intended to be one, but I do find it interesting how Rowling wrote that every summer both Snape and Harry have to return to a place that makes them terribly unhappy instead of getting to remain at Hogwarts. It's a really interesting duality between them. And I think I brought up way back in my, Philosopher's Stone review about how odd it was that Snape threatened Quirrell and why that wasn't brought up again. And I guess I forgot that it was in this book. And, considering the tight spot that Rowling got herself into with that situation, the explanation of Voldemort's pride not allowing himself to reveal this situation to Snape was an okay explanation. And speaking of explanations, let me just explain to you how much it would help me if you could leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because we are less than 200 subscribers away from 1,000 subs. Subbing is completely free, and it really helps me make a mark in this video against video cage match that is YouTube. And so if you have enjoyed my videos and you want to see more of them, it would mean a ton to just click that button down below. But for now, let's get back to this review of Half-Blood Prince. Anyway, the amount of setup done in this chapter with Draco's mission from Voldemort being revealed, the foreshadowing of the way we learn that Narcissa will be willing to turn against Voldemort in order to protect her son, and the tension that is built up between Bellatrix and Snape over Voldemort's favor was both compelling and a little creepy. And I love the irony of Voldemort lifting the half-blood like himself to a more prominent position than the devoted Death Eater and pureblood that is Bellatrix. And this book is actually fantastic for both Draco and Snape. And while Snape has had layers to him built up, Half-Blood Prince finishes setting up all the groundwork for the explosion of information about him that'll come in Deathly Hallows perfectly. And I couldn't stop myself from almost chuckling at the way that Rowling was putting everything into position for a book that wasn't even written yet. Draco, on the other hand, was about as flat as a piece of paper before this book, and he has actually come out way more fleshed out because of it. And while I do think it's a little too late, it's not completely unwelcome. I personally love the way we see Draco progress from confident and newly marked Death Eater to a frightened kid realizing he is being tormented by Voldemort and has been placed into a no-win situation. And this take on Draco, making him not a one joke per book character whose mission in life seems to be obsessing about Harry Potter, but instead a competent but lost and confused wizard, was probably one of the better changes in the book for that character. I think it also played really well off of Harry, because Harry starts to fall into this trap of making his own problems. Don't get me wrong, Draco is up to a villainous scheme, but Harry was actually set up to have a pretty good year, and it's almost like he set himself up to be miserable, because he is now the one obsessing over Draco. And there's so much more I want to talk about with Harry, but before we do, we need to talk about the Dursleys and Dumbledore, because I can't understand why this scene wasn't in the movies, because it is so satisfying. So in the beginning of the story, Dumbledore kind of needs Harry to be this lockpick into the memories of Horace Slughorn, and so he arrives at the Dursleys to pick up Harry for the summer, and Harry forgets or neglects to inform the Dursleys that Dumbledore was coming, which was hilarious. And I also love the way that Dumbledore just poked at their rudeness over and over again when he arrives. His constant jabs, where he says things like, "Oh, let's pretend you were polite and invited me inside," or "Let's imagine you were good hosts and offered me a drink." They were just fantastic. And the only critique I have of this scene is that I wish it would have happened sooner. Because during this conversation, we learn about the reason that Harry has to return every summer, and I love how Dumbledore just drives in the point that the Dursleys were the best chance Harry had for survival after his parents died. And even though he was nothing more than an innocent baby, they couldn't bring themselves to provide anything more for him than the bare necessities. And while it's not the most important point, I also like that Dumbledore points out that Harry wasn't the only abused child in the Dursleys' household, and talks about how the Dursleys were robbing Dudley of any chance to be a functioning adult in normal society. The situation with Kreacher was also not something I think I fully understood the depths of until this reading. Like, I completely forgot that Harry knows that Kreacher is responsible for tipping the Death Eaters off about Sirius, and Harry's difficulty to accept Kreacher into his service, but lack of options due to how much he knows, was actually really sad for both Harry and Kreacher. And yes, I know this eventually works out, but it was really tough to read, surprisingly so for me. But anyway, now we get to talk about a character that was introduced in this book that I actually love. And yes, I know that's kind of controversial, but Slughorn is probably one of my favorite teachers at the school. And as a teacher myself, I know if I were to act like Slughorn and show this much blatant favoritism, I'd probably have to go speak with my head of school about bias. But there's something about how he's jovial and how he's kind of slimy but not a totally bad guy, or how he lacks the Slytherin prejudice, that I just really enjoyed. I mean, nobody can deny that Slughorn is out to better himself, but I can't really say it's nepotism because he's mostly just scouting talent. He doesn't really care about your blood status or family name, he just wants to add you to his collection of successful students. And it's definitely an interesting take as on a professor at Hogwarts. He's also competent, so that helps, which is just a cherry on top because we know that Dumbledore does not have the best trajectory of hiring competent people. But I did like this switch, and it was just very interesting to see him in the Potions Master role, and then having Snape transition to the Defense Against the Dark Arts role, and having Harry have to deal with the fact that his least favorite subject is now one of his better subjects, and his favorite subject is now being taught by a person he just hates to learn from. And while there is just much more to talk about with Slughorn, especially after he gets successfully recruited, the book actually takes us to the Burrow first, and we see one of the first forced feeling romances that take place during this book. And when I was reading Order of the Phoenix, maybe I wasn't keeping my eyes open for hints of it, but the Tonks and Lupin romance is kind of strange. I don't think I miss anything, but Tonks being so down in the dumps because of Lupin just felt odd. And I know where this goes, and maybe it happens more in Deathly Hallows, but I didn't remember how weird and forced together, I guess is just the best word I can think of, for how that romance turned out. And it's not the only one. I mean, Bill and Fleur also seems pretty rushed, but we do get hints of the attraction between book 4 and this book, so I'm letting that slide, unlike the rest of the Weasleys. And yes, I know Fleur isn't making the best first impression, but Miss Weasley and Ginny were tag teaming Fleur hate like it was a cage match for most of the book, and I just felt bad for her. Funnily enough, though, the relationship between Fleur and Bill is one of the few relationships in the series that I do actually like the resolution of, Fleur standing up to Molly, who assumes she only left Bill because of his looks and still wants to marry him after he was scarred by Fenrir, which is a great way to cap that character arc together. And onto other Weasleys just killing it in this book, let's talk about Fred and George, because after getting their Hogwarts letters and Harry learning that he's going to get to be Quidditch captain this year, which I really love that they did, they head to Diagon Alley, which is the most deserted place ever now, including Ollivanders, which is another setup and plays into the main plot of Deathly Hallows, and also makes me feel bad for him because he's captured for a lot longer than I initially remembered. But the only place in all of Diagon Alley that is doing well is the joke shop that Fred and George founded, was Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. And since the first book, Fred and George have been in my top 10 favorite characters, and the way Rowling played with the idea of different forms of intelligence with these two was perfect. And another just super sweet touch was how they remembered that it was Harry who got them off the ground, and so they refused to take any of his money for their products, and I just love that Rowling showed that they were successful even though they weren't traditionally good students, because I think that's important to understand. That there can be different ways to be successful that's not just school. Their time in Diagon Alley, though, is also where the main trio gets the first hints of what Draco is planning, as they find him going into Bargain and Burke's. And I wanted to stop here because this is something that really annoyed me the first time I read this book, and still annoys me now, because The fact that for the majority of the book, Hermione and Ron don't believe Harry about Draco being a Death Eater is beyond frustrating. Like, Voldemort is known for using people. I mean, Quirrell wasn't exactly a top-shelf magical talent either, and yet the two of them are constantly doubting Harry that Voldemort could be using someone like Draco. I mean, I don't know how much of a difference it might have made to the flow of the story if they had believed him, but it was still super frustrating that they continued this debate for no reason all the time. Ron and Hermione actually both have very annoying moments in this book, and while they can't really be defended, there are some that work better than others. For example, all the romantic drama between Ron and Lavender and Hermione and Cormac, that's fine to me. They're teenagers with bad communication skills who are trying to like make each other jealous. And while Ron and Lavender have some moments that might be the cringiest ever put to page, I'm gonna let it slide. What I can't let slide is the way that Hermione is treating Harry about the Half-Blood Prince's book. And that's not to say that Hermione shouldn't be concerned about the book. After all, they all still remember the dangers of the diary from book 2. But what sucks is that is not the angle that Hermione's concern is coming from. Rather, it's irritation because she's upset, because Harry is doing better in potions than her because of the book, and that just wasn't a great look for Hermione at all. What I will say, though, is that Harry winning the liquid luck in that first potions lesson did allow for some of my favorite moments in this book. Not only him using it to get Slughorn's memory, which I actually love how the movie's portrayed, by the way, but also like the way he used it to placebo Ron, or how he gave it to the DA members to help them survive the Death Eater raid at Hogwarts. It's funny how reading these books in such close succession really makes it obvious how much better Rowling got at utilizing all the plot devices she set up in her books, not really letting as many fall onto like the back burner and just be forgotten. Like, she introduced that liquid luck early and it was used perfectly throughout the book. I also wanted to say that I know that teen romance is one of the running threads of this book, mostly because there's not going to be a lot of time for it to happen in the last novel, but Rowling isn't particularly cooking with any of them. I would call the setup for like Ron and Hermione probably just fine, but the one between Harry and Ginny is just off. And I know people are always like, the books did the romance better than the movies, but that's like a really low bar to clear, because Ginny definitely has more personality in the books, but there are a lot of times that Harry talks about like the jealousy monster in his chest, and I'm like, Harry, where did all of this come from? Because like, you weren't really expressing any of that in book 5 and in the past. Like, I think it would have been better if during Order of the Phoenix, he started having these feelings, then they continue to build in Half-Blood Prince and then expand through Deathly Hallows. But just tagging it on in this book, just, it didn't work for me, okay? Like, I love Ginny, I love Harry, this relationship, don't really care for. But the last thing I really want to talk about before we get into the reason why I've always considered this book to be probably one of the best in the series is the mystery behind Draco Malfoy. And I thought that having Malfoy use the Room of Requirement was a great utilization of the lore we already knew. And the fact that the Vanishing Cabinet that Harry broke earlier, I think it was in like book 2, is the tool utilized to get the Death Eaters into Hogwarts was just a great touch. The time spent showing Draco's desperation as he completes his impossible task of killing Dumbledore, and the way we see his decisions to harm others are like weighing on him, along with his failures when he's confronted by Harry and nearly dies, were page turners. Because despite this being like the penultimate book, Half-Blood Prince actually has more lighthearted moments than I would have expected, but when it chooses to get dark, it is not afraid to dig in there. And when Snape comes in and knows the counter curse for Sectum Sempra, you don't really even like think about it in the moment. But when he reveals himself to be the Half-Blood Prince at the end of the book, everything just like clicks into place in such a satisfying way, at least for that mystery. His choice to kill Dumbledore won't click until much later, but speaking of Dumbledore, let's get into the main reason this book ranks so highly for me, and that is the Harry and Dumbledore scenes. You see, I am a sucker for a good mentor character, and while we've seen Dumbledore be that archetype to Harry in the past, we've never seen it to the level where Dumbledore is this involved directly in Harry's life. And I remember being a kid reading this and being kind of disappointed because there was like so much talk about these private lessons, and then it ended up just being the memories and understanding Voldemort, when all I wanted was for Dumbledore to teach Harry how to do some more like impressive magic, which oddly is still a major letdown in this book, because it's not that Dumbledore doesn't teach him powerful spells, but mostly how little action Harry sees in this book. I mean, this is it. This is the last book before the climactic battle, and we don't really get to see a good look of Harry's like magical combat skills almost at all throughout this book, except for that fight with Draco. But moving past that critique, I guess, the bond that Dumbledore and Harry share in this book is beautiful. There are always two scenes that always stand out to me The first is when Harry learns that Dumbledore has been protecting him from being used like a puppet by the Ministry. And then the new Minister Rufus Scrimgeour arrives at the Burrow using Percy as this cover, which, let me just say, this is yet another bad book for Percy, who at this point is just a testament to the love of the Weasley family, because how they ever managed to forgive this guy is beyond me. But back to Harry, I'm thinking of the scene where like Scrimgeour calls Harry Dumbledore's man as if it's supposed to be an insult, and Harry just confirms it without hesitation. And then when he tells Dumbledore about it, the fact that Dumbledore it's like, oh, that was rather rude, and then Harry's like, oh, I said I was. And then Dumbledore just tears up. It's perfect. And the other scene that comes to mind is the famous line where Dumbledore tells Harry that he's not worried because he's with Harry, which is just a perfect callback to all the times Harry has said the same thing about Dumbledore. Like, Rowling may not have known how to write teen romances too well, but she killed the mentor and mentee relationship between Harry and Dumbledore. And then, of course, there was the nature of their meetings to learn more about Voldemort and develop a working theory around the Horcruxes. And I also just realized I never talked about Dumbledore's hand being cursed and how Snape could only buy him a year's worth of life and how that contributed to Dumbledore's plan. And there's just so much to love about this book and the way everything is set up for the finale. But anyway, back to the memories of Voldemort. It almost makes me wonder if, Rowling must have been reading, The Art of War when writing this book, because I remember one of the lessons basically being oh, you'll always be able to beat your opponents if you know your enemy. And Dumbledore took that to heart, as we spend pages learning about Tom Riddle before he became the monstrous Voldemort. Every single vision we got into Tom's past really helped paint the picture of the sicko that Voldemort really became. I made a video on this channel, which is still my best one to date, on the real reason why Voldemort feared Dumbledore. And in it, I emphasized the fact that much of it came from the fact that Dumbledore knew who Tom was better than almost anyone else. And in teaching that to Harry, he armed Harry with truths about Voldemort that he wanted nobody else to know. And one thing I will say is that some of those flashbacks that we see are particularly brutal, especially the ones where Merope is the central character of them. And while the message of a child who is born out of loveless circumstances being destined to be evil is probably not the best thing Rowling's ever wrote, it does almost make you respect Harry more and the way he turned out, given how parallel so much of him and his and Voldemort's circumstances were. Rowling also peels back the curtains into the challenges to come with the final book in the series, with the Horcrux hunt, because seeing the struggle even a skilled wizard like Dumbledore had in retrieving just a single Horcrux was extremely tense, and in my opinion, some of the best horror writing that Rowling has ever done for the series. And knowing that Harry is tasked with finding the rest of them puts a mounting dread on his shoulders moving into the final book, a dread that is of course amplified by the fact that he has to do it without Dumbledore, given the ending of this book. And that ending is just wow. I mean, we knew Dumbledore was not at 100%, but seeing a man we thought was so unkillable die in the manner that he did, I remember it rattling me as a kid, and honestly, it still breaks my heart now. That pleading to Severus and what we'll later understand to be the true meaning behind it was incredibly powerful, and watching the hope just drain out of Harry, replaced with this hatred for a man he'd warned Dumbledore about time and time again, and the fact that part of Harry feels if he'd only been more convincing that Dumbledore wouldn't have died, all of that just hit like a truck. And that doesn't even include the way that Rowling wrote the emotional dialogue between Malfoy and Dumbledore, and the fact that I believe if he had just been given a little more time, Malfoy would have taken Dumbledore up on his offer for protection. And it just cements the tragedy that is Draco's life. I mean, honestly, what else is there to say about this book? I mean, there's the funeral, Harry's decision to break up with Ginny and not return to Hogwarts for the final year, the reveal that Snape was the Half-Blood Prince, and all of it just perfectly sets the stage for Deathly Hallows, which I wonder if it ever really had a chance to live up to all the expectations that Half-Blood Prince sets on his shoulder, because the setup was so good that it's one of those situations where it's how could the final book be executed in a way to meet everyone's expectations? It must have been a huge challenge that Rowling faced when writing that book. I guess all that's left to do is to make the argument for this book being considered the best in the series, so here it goes. Half-Blood Prince might be the best in the series due to the character development, the emotional gut punches, and all the build-up that Rowling has been quietly laying the groundwork for 6 books now. everything just starts to click into place and everything is perfectly positioned for the final entry into the series. More than any other, this book intertwines the personal with the epic. Harry's relationship with Dumbledore reaches its most poignant and powerful, with Dumbledore taking a more direct mentor role than ever, and it gives us more insight into the psyche of Voldemort himself. Those trips to the Pensive where we learn more about Tom Riddle are all absolute gold, and we get to see just how he became this twisted villain, not just through his actions, but through the fear he inspires and his obsession with power. Rowling just gives us this perfect blend of backstory and character study, and it's so satisfying to see how everything just fits together by the end. And while it does have its downside with like minor pacing issues where certain things linger on for far longer, like the romances, than they should, and things that are more important, like the lessons where I wanted to see more of, aren't as expansive, it still is just everything that I need from it works. That's why for me, Half-Blood Prince isn't just a strong book. It has a strong chance of being the best in the series. Everything has a purpose. The characters are developed with more passion than ever before. Draco Malfoy making his major transition from school bully to kid stuck with one impossible choice after another is just like one of the major standouts. And the mysteries laid out to be perfectly solved in the next book. It's just, I can't think of another book in the series, outside of Chamber of Secrets maybe, but we don't have to revisit that has been more fun to read. And I would really like to know in the comment section below, where does Half-Blood Prince rank in your personal rating? But whatever it is you choose to do next, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And please stick around for End Screen Jared as he recommends a couple videos for you. But until next time, peace. Hey there guys, and welcome to the End Screen. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're looking for more content, don't hesitate to check out my last ranking Potter, which was of course Order the Phoenix, or perhaps checking out my review of Rupert Holmes' crime fiction, Murder Your Employer. But whatever it is you choose to do next, I hope you have a great rest of your day.